When 67-year-old Franklin Moore was arrested for stealing a loaf of bread from a Brooklyn corner store, no one in the courtroom gave him a second glance. Dressed in tattered clothes, thin from years of malnourishment, and carrying a worn military backpack, he looked like just another homeless man caught in the system. But when the judge, Honorable William Hadley, read his full name aloud, the courtroom fell silent. The judge stood. He had just realized that the man before him wasn't a stranger. He was the soldier who had once saved his life in Iraq 2 decades earlier. Franklin had served over 20 years in the U.S. Army, including 3 combat tours. After his wife passed away from cancer due to a misdiagnosis by the VA, he lost everything: his home, his pension, even his will to fight. Still, he never begged. He simply endured. The moment in court became a turning point, not just for Franklin, but for a broken system that had forgotten him. What began as a petty theft case transformed into a national conversation about how America treats its veterans. And for Franklin Moore, the man who had once carried others to safety, justice finally came, not with noise, but with recognition. Sometimes all a person really needs is for someone to finally see them, not as a problem, but as a person who gave everything and asked for nothing. For over a decade, Franklin Moore drifted through the streets of Brooklyn, quiet, anonymous, and unseen. Locals knew him only as the older man with the weathered army backpack and silver beard. He didn't ask for money. He didn't make a scene. He simply gathered bottles for recycling, slept in alleyways, and kept to himself. Few knew that this unassuming man had once worn the uniform of a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army and had received the Bronze Star for valor under fire. Franklin had served 21 years in the military, including deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan. He was the kind of soldier who always looked out for the men under his command. In 2003, during an ambush near Fallujah, Franklin drove a burning fuel truck away from his convoy, suffering second-degree burns but saving 17 lives. One of those lives belonged to a young medic named Michael Hadley, who would later become a judge. But Franklin's greatest battle came after he came home. In 2008, his wife, Margaret, was diagnosed with late-stage cancer, a condition the VA hospital had initially misdiagnosed. Her death shattered Franklin's world. Grief turned to rage. Rage gave way to silence. He sold their small apartment and gave the proceeds to her favorite charity. Then he walked away from it all: his pension, his benefits, and his name. The system had failed the person he loved most. Franklin no longer trusted it to care for him. He didn't want pity. He wanted to disappear. For years, Franklin existed on the margins. Shopkeepers hosed down the sidewalks where he tried to sleep. Teenagers mocked him. Police told him to move along. Even other homeless individuals gave him space, sensing his quiet sorrow. On cold nights, he clutched a faded photo of Margaret wrapped in plastic, whispering, "Almost there, Maggie. Just holding on a little longer." He never told anyone who he was. He never cashed in on his service. He never even applied for food stamps. The only thing that tied him to his former life was a pair of worn dog tags and a military ID so faded it was barely legible. Then came the day he was arrested for taking a loaf of bread from a corner market. When he appeared in court the next morning, no one knew his story. Not the bailiff, not the young prosecutor, not even his overworked public defender. To them, he was just another vagrant, until the judge, Michael Hadley, read his full name and realized the truth. Franklin Moore was not a criminal. He was his savior. Judge Hadley had never forgotten the soldier who carried him over 2 miles to safety under heavy fire. For 20 years, he'd searched for Sergeant Grady without success. Now, that same man stood before him, thin and forgotten, charged with petty theft. In a single moment, the entire courtroom changed. The judge ordered a full review of Franklin's records. It was discovered that due to a clerical error, his benefits had been cut off years ago. He was owed over $246,000 in back pay, along with full medical care. Charges were dropped, and Franklin was released, not as a criminal, but as a hero who had simply fallen through the cracks. Franklin never sought the spotlight, but in that moment, the country he once served finally saw him again, and perhaps more importantly, they remembered the thousands like him, quiet heroes with invisible wounds, still waiting to be seen. The courtroom was nearly empty when Franklin appeared for his hearing. His clothes were wrinkled from a night in holding, and his eyes betrayed a lifetime of battles no one had noticed. The young prosecutor stood and listed the facts coldly. A homeless man caught stealing food with prior infractions, no fixed address, no family in attendance. To most, it was just another case among thousands. Then the judge looked down at the name on the file. His hand froze. The color drained from his face. Franklin Moore. Judge Michael Hadley abruptly stood, something rarely done during such proceedings, and stared at the man before him. His voice caught. He recessed the court and disappeared into chambers, leaving murmurs and confusion in his wake. Inside, Judge Hadley opened an old drawer and pulled out a faded photograph. Soldiers standing before a medical tent in Iraq. Among them was a young field medic himself, and standing tall in the back row, unmistakable despite the years, was Staff Sergeant Franklin Moore. Hadley had spent years trying to find the soldier who had dragged him to safety under fire in 2003, 2 miles through the desert with shrapnel in his own leg. The man who had kept him alive by whispering, "Keep breathing, kid." Your story isn't over. Now that very same man stood accused of stealing bread, forgotten, alone. Back in court the next morning, everything had changed. Instead of a frazzled public defender, Franklin was now represented by a respected attorney from the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. The courtroom was full. Reporters, veterans, and curious observers packed the benches. 3 high-ranking military officers in full-dress uniform entered and stood silently, commanding immediate attention. Among them was Colonel James Mason, who had served alongside Franklin. Taking the stand, Colonel Mason's testimony cut through the room like a drumbeat. Franklin had saved 17 lives during that ambush in Iraq, including a young medic named Michael Hadley. His bravery had never been properly recognized, and due to an administrative failure after his wife's death, his pension and benefits had been terminated for over 15 years. He should never have been homeless, Mason stated firmly. He should have been honored. The judge removed his glasses, visibly shaken, and spoke directly to Franklin. "I didn't know your full name. I've carried guilt for years, grateful for the life I have because of what you did. My family, my career, they exist because you didn't leave me behind." Franklin, clearly overwhelmed, responded in a rough voice, "I was just doing my job, sir." Judge Hadley's reply was simple but powerful. "And we failed to do ours. For you." The courtroom fell into emotional silence. The prosecutor, now visibly moved, announced that all charges were dropped with prejudice. Franklin Moore, once invisible, was free to go. But more than that, he was finally seen. Outside the courtroom, Franklin was embraced by Margaret's niece, Rebecca, who had been searching for him for years. Reporters swarmed, but Franklin barely registered the attention. For the first time in over a decade, someone had reached for him, not with suspicion, but with gratitude. In the days that followed, a fund in Franklin's name raised over $200,000. The VA issued a formal apology and began reviewing other veterans' benefit terminations. A plaque was installed at the Brooklyn courthouse to honor forgotten heroes like him. And Judge Hadley, now more than just a former medic, became his friend. Franklin once carried others through fire. Now, finally, his country had carried him home. In the days following Franklin Moore's emotional courtroom revelation, the story of the forgotten veteran who had once saved 17 lives in Iraq and then vanished into homelessness spread across America like wildfire. News outlets ran headlines such as, "The soldier who saved a judge then slept on the streets," and "One man's story, thousands like him." Social media lit up with praise, anger, and most importantly, reflection. People from every corner of the country reached out. Veterans shared their own stories of being overlooked, misjudged, or left behind. Donations poured into the fund set up for Franklin, quickly surpassing $200,000, with letters attached. "This is for my father, who never got the thanks he deserved. You made us remember what honor really looks like." The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, under public pressure, issued a statement acknowledging the administrative failure that cost Franklin 15 years of benefits. An emergency review of similar terminated accounts was launched, with the hope of correcting errors that had left other heroes without care or housing. Local governments took notice too. In Brooklyn, the courthouse where Franklin once stood in handcuffs now bore a bronze plaque in his honor. The image etched into it depicted him carrying a wounded medic, Judge Hadley, through a battlefield with the words, "Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten." The City Council introduced the Grady Initiative, a legal aid fund dedicated to assisting homeless veterans facing misdemeanor charges. Judge Hadley, now publicly recused from Franklin's case, used his voice to push for systemic change, speaking at universities and law schools about ethical memory, the obligation to remember those who served, especially when society forgets. For Franklin, the transition back into stability was quiet but meaningful. He moved into Veterans Village, a supportive housing community where for the first time in 15 years he had a door to lock and a bed to call his own. His apartment was modest, just a few rooms. But on one wall, he hung 3 photographs. His late wife Margaret on their wedding day, his unit in Iraq. A new photo of himself with Judge Hadley, both in dress uniform, standing side by side at a veterans recognition ceremony. Though many interview requests came in, Franklin declined most. He didn't want to become a symbol. He wanted to be useful again. He began volunteering at local high schools, talking not about medals or battles, but about what happens after the war ends, about grief, purpose, and how easily silence can swallow someone whole. At one assembly, a teenager raised his hand and asked if Franklin was angry about all the years he had lost. Franklin paused, then replied, "I'm not angry. I'm grateful someone finally looked up and saw me. That's enough. But I hope that because of me, the next guy won't have to wait 15 years. On Veterans Day, Franklin stood before a crowd at Fort Hamilton. For the first time in decades, he wore his full uniform. His bronze star and purple heart rested above his heart, but his words were simple. "I once protected this country. Now the country has protected me back. That's what we call full circle." As he stepped down from the podium, the crowd of veterans, young and old, rose in unison to salute him. It wasn't just about Franklin Moore anymore. It was about all those who wore the uniform, came home, and were forgotten. Now they had a voice again, and it started with one man who simply wanted the strength to live one more day. 6 months after the courtroom scene that brought a nation to tears, Franklin Moore, a man once invisible on the streets of Brooklyn, stood tall in a tailored suit. He was no longer the homeless veteran arrested for stealing bread. He was now the face of a movement, a symbol of redemption, and a reminder that kindness, even delayed, still matters. Inside the judge's chambers at Brooklyn's courthouse, Franklin received what had been owed to him for years. A representative from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs handed him a formal letter and a ceremonial check, $246,000 in back benefits, plus a monthly pension moving forward. The Bronze Star and Purple Heart medals, once tucked away in the bottom of his military pack, were now pinned proudly on his chest. "This isn't just mine," Franklin said quietly to the cameras. "It belongs to every veteran who went unseen, unheard, and unacknowledged. I just hope the next one won't have to wait this long." His words resonated across the country. The image of Franklin carrying a wounded soldier during a 2003 ambush in Fallujah, once buried in military archives, re-emerged in newspapers and online platforms next to a haunting comparison. The same man, 20 years later, sleeping in a doorway. The contrast forced Americans to confront a painful truth, that many who wore the uniform returned to a country unprepared to care for them. Legislators cited Franklin's story when drafting reforms to streamline veteran services, reevaluate terminated benefits, and improve mental health outreach. The Grady Initiative expanded beyond Brooklyn, inspiring similar programs in other major cities. A bipartisan congressional bill, the MORE Act, was introduced to provide legal aid and expedited benefit reviews for homeless or at-risk veterans. Meanwhile, Franklin adjusted to a new rhythm of life. At Veterans Village, where he now lived, he planted a small garden outside his apartment. He spent mornings tending to tomato vines and afternoons speaking at schools, churches, and community events. He never dramatized his story. He didn't need to. His quiet voice carried more weight than any headline. At one town hall meeting, a boy no older than 10 approached Franklin with wide eyes and asked, "Were you scared when they forgot about you?" Franklin knelt down slowly, his knees still stiff from old injuries, and replied, "What scared me wasn't being forgotten. It was thinking I didn't matter anymore, but someone saw me. That's all it takes, one person who cares." That message echoed far and wide. In recognition of his service and resilience, Franklin was invited to Washington, D.C. to speak at a Veterans Day event. Standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he addressed an audience of fellow soldiers, lawmakers, and families. His speech was brief, but no one forgot it. "They taught us in the Army. Never leave a man behind, but sometimes it's not the battlefield that abandons you, it's everything that comes after. I didn't survive war to die in silence, and now, because you listened, I didn't." That moment, broadcast live on national television, became a defining image of 21st century patriotism, not wrapped in glory or power, but in humility, truth, and second chances. Franklin Moore never asked for a parade, a statue, or applause. But outside the courthouse where he had once stood accused, the city installed a bronze relief of him carrying that wounded medic, now known to the world as Judge William Hadley, with the American flag flowing behind them. Below it, an inscription read, "Not everyone who serves comes home whole, but every one of them deserves to be seen." From Brooklyn alleyways to the halls of Congress, Franklin's journey reminded America that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is simply look up and recognize those who gave everything without asking for anything in return. For 15 years, Franklin Moore walked through life invisible. Once a decorated Army staff sergeant, now just another face on the streets. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't complain. He simply endured. But in one quiet courtroom moment, when a judge recognized him, not as a homeless man, but as the soldier who had once saved his life, the world shifted. It wasn't about medals or recognition, it was about finally being seen. Life doesn't always reward us when we expect it to. Sometimes it forgets us, sometimes it walks right past us. But Franklin's story reminds us that dignity doesn't fade with hardship, and real worth isn't measured by clothes, titles, or where you sleep at night. It lives in the choices we make, the people we help, and the sacrifices we carry quietly. If you've ever felt forgotten, know this: your story still matters. You are not invisible. Have you ever seen someone misjudged because of how they looked or where they were in life? Share that moment in the comments below. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear today. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to LT Heartstrings. We're here to remind the world that honor, kindness, and second chances still exist if we're willing to see them. Because sometimes justice doesn't wear a robe. Sometimes it just walks in, remembers your name, and says, I never forgot you.